I didn't see anything with his name. But it does look nice.
Good for Mark, but Fairview always played dirty, at least when I played, they were pretty dirty teams.
They're pretty aggressive.
That's not what I called it, but.
Okay,
You
thank
guys
you.
wanna buy some old junk? November 13th.
Oh, that's it.
That's it? Okay, thank you.
I think I got a penalty out here. You were trying to pull hair on my legs, so I got up there. Leg on me. I said the guy's trying to pull hair on my legs. Whatever.
Yeah.
That's not what they go for these days.
I know.
No.
They've learned more targets.
You were good. You were first.
I'd say maybe I'd say at least between 50 and 100. The early teens. Like 92.
You look sharp. You been in court all day?
No, I was doing it for you guys.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure.
We went down the stairs and up the stairs and the wastewater plant.
I got one that says Taylor on it.
And that,
No, I didn't want it.
Remember when that dry cleaner?
The dry cleaners here charge like exorbitant fees.
I was gonna say, that stink's gonna stick to your suit.
It's like usually how much they charge.
I mean, I don't know what's the problem with the lights on the wall.
Well, this Mr. Corbett.
Expensive.
Hey, your life is good. Life is good, buddy.
What's that?
Well, he was having a meeting and saying a prayer, but usually when he does, the preacher shows up.
Yeah. He looks like his boss. That guy looks like Dave's boss.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I'm
Jeff,
not
did you
off the
talk
hook.
Associate with
I
Sam.
keep getting.
Jeff, did you talk to Dave
You
about?
got free time, and you go by me.
Sam and
Carter.
No,
I don't want the mayor, and I just say I got one with Matt, very good.
no, not Sam. I think this is his face.
say it sure didn't look like him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here,
Well, yeah. Punish us after a
Thanks,
day
Sean.
off.
I'll blame the division, that's blame the division.
Terrible.
We're done? No.
Happy that way.
No,
Right?
We'll be getting underway in just about 1 minute.
Then you guys complain that you're never in the loop on things, so we just said.
I can read.
Thanks for reminding.
Figure out how to get it run.
Doesn't ring that off. Mike seems to bring it inopportune.
Tell Sean there's 8 items, so no executive session.
My half-inch hole ends up being over.
Stay tuned.
Kids. Grandma.
Can you splice?
None that I initiated,
Right.
none that came from me.
In the old days, we used to group them.
Get one.
Oh, can't group them.
Lowe's or not? Okay, cause they, well, and then I put the security cameras up, like, and that's what I want, it's all waterproof, I can always caulk it, I don't wanna lay.
Bring back other stuff. No, I bring it.
Right, we'll be getting underway in about 20 seconds.
County official is, just see what the investment is.
Good evening and welcome to the Defiance City Council meeting for tonight, September 28th, 2021. It's always before council, we open up meeting with prayer from a local pastor. This evening we have Pastor Matt Parks from King's Cross Church opening us up in prayer. Thanks for being our guest tonight, Pastor Parks.
Thanks, Dave. Good evening, everyone. I just want to open with just a couple of verses, and then I will pray from Romans chapter 11. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are His judgments, and how inscrutable His ways. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for these men and women who have gathered, Lord, for the benefit of our city. So God, I pray that you will give them wisdom as they lead. Lord, as your scriptures tell us that you have the depths of wisdom. So God, I would pray that they will receive the wisdom that you give, that they will humbly ask for the wisdom to lead in the capacities that you have given them. Lord, for it is from you, it is through you that all things have been made. And it's to your glory. It's in your holy and precious name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Parks. Call this meeting to order. Let the record show that all members of council are present. Would you stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I reviewed the index minutes for 3 of our city council meetings for August 24th, September 7th, and September 14th. Do we have a motion to correct or amend any of the index minutes as presented? Without any, I'll approve the same. Do we have any liaison meeting requests or reports? Without any, do we have any comments from council? Mr. Corbett.
Comment, maybe a lesson, I guess. I've received a handful of calls about high-speed internet problems on South Clinton Street to the south boundary of our town. All Spectrum customers, all of them are people that have work from home options that they do, and it's creating some issues. They want to know if there's anything the city can do. I typically say no, call Spectrum, but it doesn't usually give them the answer they want. I know that high-speed internet right now is a big deal for kids if they have to do their school from home now, and people, there's more and more people working from home. That, I don't know if there's anything we can do.
I went out and met with the Spectrum folks a month or so ago, and I have to say I was pretty impressed when Jen English went with me. I was very impressed actually, with the system they outlined for their customers to present them with any questions, concerns, complaints, if you will. And they talked through the process. Did the folks you talked to, Mr. Corbett, indicate that they had called Spectrum?
Yes, they've had them out there. It doesn't seem that.
Okay.
What I'm hearing, a commonality is they think it's a infrastructure problem. They don't have the fiber optic laid out that way yet, so that's slowing things down. So I don't know if that's.
But I will reach out to them specifically. Maybe if you could either after the meeting or send me the names and addresses, or at least the names of a couple of those folks, and I'll talk to Spectrum about it directly and get back with you.
Sure, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other comments from council, Mrs. Crutch?
Yes, at the corner of South Clinton and Kaiser Road, where they were doing the blacktopping in the new road there, there's black skirting that's still up, and I've had a few people call me and wondering if that is city skirting or is that the people that did the street skirting, and is that something that's going to be coming down soon?
I asked about that as well. When the grass is 80% grown, they will take the skirting down.
All right, I will tell the people when they call me.
I have said that to a couple people that have asked me, but I will make a note of it because we'll look. We've had some pretty good grass growing weather, so we'll check it out. Mrs. Crutch, thank you.
And then the other thing I've had people call concerning our recycling, and I know that we strictly stick to cardboard and those items, but in Waterville they have an actual dumpster for glass products, and is there any way that our city could have a station set up where we could put glass items and maybe that company would come and get that dumpster?
So it's a company that's separate from their.
I do believe so. In Waterville, they have 4 or 5 dumpsters at the Kroger's there that you can put your construction, cardboard in one and other paper products in one and whatever.
Okay,
And they have a glass one, and I don't know if there's something that we could do for glass products.
I'll check.
All right.
The
thank you.
issue with the glass, I think you understand, is
Right,
the difficulty in selling the commodity itself.
Right.
Nobody wants to buy glass.
right. And I didn't know where this company is actually taking their glass products, but maybe that's something we could check on.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Crutch. Mr. Wack, any other comments from council? All right, I just have two things on my desk. One is a liquor license application from CTJ and MRB LLC, D-Town Food Mart and Oasis at 875 South Clinton Street, Defiance, Ohio. Is there any request for hearing on this matter? No? Okay.
Take care of it.
And also just a comment that our visitation to the Kingsbury lift station this afternoon went rather well. I was impressed at the operation that they have going there. They seemed really organized and able to explain everything that was going on. And I'm not easily impressed. I thought they have a really nice operation and they explained everything that they do out there well. With that, onto the Board of Control, Mayor McCann.
I referred to that, President McMaster, as the sewer tour.
Yeah.
Thank you. Couple things to go through. First up, Rib Fest was this past weekend. I'm guessing everyone in the room knows that. And it was, again, another nice event. Everyone, for the most part, behaved themselves. And we're already looking forward to next year. I believe the Water Division was in charge of weather this year. Great job, fellas. And I'm not sure who's saddled with that for next year. On a more serious note, we have an opening and a closing this weekend. We'll be closing the Splash Park on Monday after this weekend. If you look at the extended forecast, it's supposed to stay fairly cold. So it is probably time we get it closed up and winterized. But the good news is the roundabout at Cleveland and Ottawa will be opening up sometime over the weekend. I can't say when because we don't know exactly when, but looking at the forecast, they'll be able to finish. So it will be open, but their construction will continue yet for several weeks. There's grading to do, there's grass to plant, there's light poles to put up. So I would ask that the public continue to move very cautiously through that intersection and be mindful that from time to time there'll be equipment moving around and we'll just need to be careful. But I'm guessing everyone will be glad that it's opened back up and most everyone will be glad it's a roundabout. Also, tomorrow, the intersections of Perry and 3rd, Wayne and 3rd, and Wayne and 5th, where currently there are traffic signals, red, yellow, green. Those will be going flashing red in all four directions, and those will become four-way stops. And we'll leave those lights flashing for a period of time until we think everybody's got it all figured out. Again, I would just ask at those new four-way stops that everyone be mindful. They stop and look in all directions and make sure that incoming traffic is going to stop as well. They be mindful of pedestrians. I will tell you, probably the number one concern that I hear is pedestrians that don't feel like they are given the consideration by the motoring public. And so I just would ask for everybody to be more considerate of the pedestrian traffic. So that all happens tomorrow. And that's all I have, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have two expenditures of money. One for Virtual Technology Group, Inc. for $15,494, and that is for a 3-year support subscription for our servers. And the second one being to Xylem for a water quality zond for the amount of $17,500. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. Mr. O'Donnell?
Mr. President, I would request an executive session to consider confidential information related to the marketing plans, specific business strategy, production techniques, trade secrets, or personal financial statements of an applicant for economic development assistance, where the information is directly related to a request for economic development assistance to be provided or administered under section 5709.61 to 5709.69 Ohio Revised Code, and that's pursuant to section 121.22 G8 of the Ohio Revised Code.
So we have a request for an executive session after legislation this evening. Do we have a motion? Motion, Mr. Waxler. Second, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Right, so before this evening. Anything else, Mr. O'Donnell?
And acknowledging the risk to my personal safety, Mr. President, I would request an executive session to consider the confidential information related to the marketing plans, specific business strategy, production techniques, trade secrets, or personal financial statements of an applicant for economic development assistance, where this time the information is directly related to a request for economic development assistance that involves public infrastructure improvements directly related to an economic development project. Again, that's Ohio Revised Code, section 121.22 G8, just a different subsection.
So we have a second request for executive session.
So moved.
So moved, Mr. Hancock.
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
All right, that's two. Anything further, Mr. O'Donnell?
Nothing for now.
All right. And Mr. Leonard?
Nothing at this time.
All right, thank you. All right, this evening we do have, I believe, 8 items of legislation for discussion this evening. Would you read the caption for the first one, Ms. Elders?
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing the city administrator to award a contract for the maintenance truck for the Water Pollution Control Division.
Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Mr. President. This piece of legislation actually gives us support for a new pickup truck. It's actually a truck that is used as a utility truck in the wastewater division. The wastewater division is actually wanting to purchase the chassis and the truck at this point. And it's sort of like a phased-in process because that truck also will require a box with a crane on that box. This piece of equipment is actually used for our pump stations. It pulls pumps in various pump stations. The low bid in this case was Mark Motes Ford in the amount of $48,570. We do want to proceed forward to purchase the vehicle because obviously with the market conditions the way they are today, it's been very difficult getting trucks. So we think it's going to be a while. I think in talking to our superintendent, that box will be purchased in next year's budget cycle. So we want to make sure that we put the order in for the truck now and the chassis and move forward with that and then add the box on next year.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard? Mr. Hancock?
Do we currently have one in operation? If we do, will we be utilizing any of the parts from that, or will we be salvaging it?
We'll
Do you know what the
be,
plan
we'll be
is?
selling that truck. We'll be using it up to the point that when we get the new truck and have to use that as well. But it's rusting out and it's getting old. We need to move on from it at this point.
Thank you.
Mr. Waxler?
Is this in this year's budget, John, or is this?
It is. Actually, we budgeted, I believe, $70,000 for this, so probably only could spend the 48 this year and then re-budget the balance for the
That's what I was thinking.
equipment next year.
All right.
Mr. Engel?
No other discussion, motion to suspend a call.
If we have no other questions, we have a motion to suspend and call.
Second, sir.
Second, Mr. Corbett?
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Hancock?
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast?
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Right, this motion is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing the engagement of Brecker and Eckler a special counsel for preparing project delivery contracts and declaring an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. With council's indulgence, I'll talk about this ordinance and the next one together, and then you could vote separately. You may recall authorizing the city to acquire the 40.1 and some change acres back in, March of this year. And then later on May 11th, you authorized the city administrator to enter into a grant agreement with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in order to create a wetland along East River Drive and Domersville in that quadrant, in that section. The purpose, again, is to make a wetland, convert the property, which is currently farm ground, and in a flood zone into that wetland. There's about 480 acres that drain into that, and that consists of other farmland, the golf course, Kettering Hills or Eagle Rock, and then all those homeowners in Kettering Hills that dump fertilizer on their lawns. It all drains down into that, and so that's an ideal spot for a wetland to protect the river. However, because of the technical requirements of the project, which I wouldn't do justice by trying to name, but it requires removing tile under the fields and planting special plants. We are recommending to pursue a more nuanced project delivery method than the standard design, bid, build, general contractor method that we typically use for construction projects. So like typically in our general contractor type projects, we would authorize the contract separately between the designer and the general contractor. So we would contract the design professional to develop the plans and the specs for the project. We get them all, we put them into nice bid specs, and then we bid the project out, and then the general contractor, who was the lowest and best bidder, would take over on the project. What this design build method would do is create an integrated project delivery system and combine that design and construction element into that one responsive firm for the request for qualifications. I will tell you it's more expensive than your traditional project. The price tag here is the $24,000 to produce the documents and help resolve any selection disputes. And unlike the other costs and construction costs for this project, this is one item that is not covered by the ODNR grant. It's at the city's expense. So we think you should all know that. But it does offer the more protection for the city from contract disputes later that, as I'm sure you all remember, can be very costly because of that, because of those disputes. And so it furthermore enables the contractors and the design professionals to coordinate during the planning of this. Will this work? Is this feasible? Can we do this? So your approval would allow us to pursue this relatively novel project delivery method for this new wetland.
Thank you. Mr. Hancock.
In this ordinance, I noticed that you spoke of the 24,000, but we also have a cap, I believe, of 30,000. So that would be where we're at with this ordinance, correct?
That's correct, and that's a cost containment measure I use, Mr. Hancock, with outside counsel, because I just say, look, I can't. I'll go to council. I'll try to get their approval, but I can't issue you a blank check.
So a great idea to do that. I mean, especially in this situation. So.
Right.
Yeah, good idea.
Thank you.
Mr. Rusty.
No questions, motion to suspend and call?
If we have no questions, we'll motion to suspend and call. Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt. Mr. Engel. Second. Mr. Hancock.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
All right. And this ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance adding section 151.06 and amending section 151.03D of the codified ordinances of the city of Defiance, Ohio, and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Yeah, so this basically codifies what we just talked about, the ability to use this project delivery method in projects. When we discussed this with some of the law firms that we talked to earlier, one of their questions was, does your charter allow it, or does your codified ordinances allow it? Well, we looked, and charter doesn't touch it. Our codified ordinances don't prohibit it, but also don't discuss it. So what this ordinance does is it inserts into our code in 151.06. It's a new section that we're allowed to pursue this method. As I said earlier, these projects are a little bit more expensive on the front end. We wouldn't pursue this very often, this kind of design build project, but we would pursue it when it makes sense. And this is one of those situations where we would want to amend the code with emergency legislation so that we can begin this project.
Thank you. Mr. Waxler.
So if you use this ordinance again, this is something though that you will bring to council. It's not just saying we're giving you the right to spend 30,000, correct, or whatever?
Right, the contract limits would remain in effect. It's just that our ordinances that exist right now, Mr. Waxler, only discuss like competitive or the general contracting design bid build method through competitive bidding, or some of the specialty delivery methods. It doesn't really expressly state that you can do a design build project, and this way we have that in case we're ever challenged.
Any other questions for Mr. O'Donnell?
No further questions. Motion to suspend the call.
Motion to suspend and call Mrs. Crutch.
Second, sir.
Second, Mr. Corbett.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Ingo?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
And motion to adopt Mrs. Crutch. Second, Mr. Mast.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Ingo?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And this ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance approving the current and replacement pages to Defiance codified ordinances and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is an ordinance that should look familiar to all of you. It stems from the desire and really the requirement under Article 18, Section 3 of our state constitution to exercise our police powers to the limits of, to the extent that they're not in conflict with state general law. So these are the changes to the Ohio Revised Code in the traffic and criminal sections last year. What you're doing tonight is ensuring that the city ordinances mirror those Ohio Revised Code changes. And what that does is it eliminates confusion with law enforcement. Not that they're confused, but it creates consistency when they're within the municipal boundaries.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. O'Donnell in these regards?
No further question, we'll suspend and call.
If we have no questions, we have a motion to suspend and call. Mr. Waxler. Second, Ms. Giaresti.
Mr. Ingo?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
And a motion to adopt, Mr. Corbett.
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Ingo?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Right. This ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance requesting the Director of Transportation to proceed with the paving project of North Clinton Street from Elliott Road to the northern municipal boundary and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Council may recall earlier this year providing the preliminary consent to pursue a repaving for Ohio Department of Transportation to pursue a repaving project on North Clinton Street from Elliott Road Really, the project's gonna go all the way to the Defiance Williams County line, but the portion that you are being asked to approve is to the northern municipal boundary. It's required, your continued approval is required under section 5521.05. Now that we have the cost share estimate of $9,026, and your approval gives the city administrator the formal authority to execute any and all documents with the Ohio Department of Transportation and tender the estimated $9,026.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. O'Donnell in these regards? Mr. Esty?
No questions, motion suspend and call.
You have a motion to suspend and call. Second, Mrs. Crutch.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes. Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Hancock.
Second.
Second, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And this ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing a contract for the purchase of 3 nutrient monitors for water quality measurements near the water treatment plant intake.
Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. President. This piece of legislation allows for the expenditure of equipment to actually monitor the water intake. It will test certain nutrients that are coming into the plant. And this is something that is going to enhance the ability to actually pump into the reservoir, because what you're going to be able to determine is how much ammonia, how much nitrogen, phosphorus is in the water. And the city was successful enough to receive a grant in the amount of around $90,000 from the Great Lakes Observing System to actually install this data. I have with me tonight Adam McDowell and Joe Ewers, and I think as we move on in time, you'll find that we're doing more and more with water quality. GAC is coming into the plant, and we're spending a lot of money to increase the end product and make water quality an issue. But not just at the plant, we're also making sure that the tributaries and what we're bringing into the plant, we have better data and better information on, so we can manage it a little bit better. The 2 gentlemen that are here tonight are the superintendent and the assistant superintendent, and I have to tell you, we're pretty lucky to have them. Adam has a class 4 license, which is a pretty big deal in Ohio. Joe has his class 3, which is also a big deal. And the expertise that they have in water and making water is something that this city values very much. And if you have any questions for them, or if they have any comments, they're here tonight to answer those questions. But again, we're here to try to improve the quality that we bring in and have an idea of just what we're taking in. And as time moves on, I think, and we're talking about water quality, we're going to be able to have a better determination of exactly what it is that we're bringing into the plant.
Thank you. Mr. Esty.
Are these recommended improvements for like the city of Defiance?
Well, I think, and I'll let Adam speak, but my comment to that, Joe, would be, I think that EPA is ratcheting down on water quality, period. I think that the controls that they're putting on these people are tighter and tighter. The requirements that they have are becoming tighter. They're constantly changing. It could be TTHMs, it could be a number of different things. And the reporting requirements are critical to what we do and what they do. So EPA is bringing about changes, and they're putting more and more pressure on these operators. And believe me, when I say that finding a class 4 operator in Ohio is pretty tough to do. But Adam, you might want to comment on that.
Well, when we talk about the GAC was recommended as far as treatment goes. We had 2 separate consultants research that and come to best conclusion of what fit our plant and our current condition and upcoming, not only the contaminants we're dealing with now, but what's coming. Which there's a bunch of Teflon contaminants, PFAS, and some of those things have been started to be talked about in the news a little bit. But these chemical sampling equipment that we're looking at here, this is part of a different approach that we wanted to, that we started a long time ago, which is to establish the water quality that you see in the upper Maumee prior to the Auglaize or the Tiffin, because there's a lot of emphasis on what happens further downstream, but very little study that's been done above our water plant specifically, other than data that we've pulled. And we have a pretty challenging river upstream of the water plant, a lot worse than a lot of people realize. And what this will allow us to do is give us real-time information, not just grab samples, whatever. It'll literally every 15 minutes we'll be pulling information on this river, and it'll be available in the cloud. So there's a number of groups that'll have access to it, actually public access to it at any given time. Along with these 3 meters that Jeff had mentioned, the YSI sonde earlier as a purchase order that was ordered already. Not only will these 3 meters there, but the sonde will also detect pH, temperature, turbidity on the river. It'll also do phycocyanin and chlorophyll, which is algal blooms. We see really regular algal blooms on the river. There will be a very significant amount of data coming off this river all the time, available real time. So it's a big project and a lot of end users that have interest in it.
Not only end users, but it's pertinent information for us.
Yeah.
Every day, every hour, whether we can pump to the river, whether we can pump to the reservoir or not, so.
Mrs. Crutch?
So if we have this data on the nitrate, phosphate, and ammonia levels, have we monitored this before we've gotten these nutrient monitors?
Right now, we do that with grab samples. So we pull samples constantly and run them in our lab. One of the biggest problems we have out of there is ammonia, which is kind of specific to our river. And anytime that we're pumping water from the river into the reservoir, we're doing ammonia tests twice a shift because ammonia fluctuates so heavy in the river and it affects our treatment so much. So what that'll do is replace those grab samples. So we only pull the samples when we're pumping or where we think the river is good enough to pump. So what happens, we have large gaps in our data of when it's at its worst. So, we'll pull samples every couple of days as those numbers should be dropping for nitrates and ammonia. And so there's a lot of holes in our data and it's very time consuming.
So these sensors will do it continuously?
All the time. And they'll actually run, we're putting them in the plant itself in a protected area, and then we're pumping water up to them. So all winter long, under the ice, all that information should be able to be recorded. So a lot of these are places where if you get high water and floods, then the equipment doesn't work anymore. Our system should work regardless. So we should have good real-time data all the time.
So will these sensors just be in the Maumee? They'll not be on the Auglaize River?
Nope, this is where we pull from is even before the Tiffin. It will just be the upper Maumee itself.
Just a quick comment, okay, because this kind of speaks to Adam's ability. Adam informed me probably 5, maybe even 7 years ago, we needed to go to GAC. A lot of the other areas and water plants around us didn't go to GAC. He's saying they should have gone to GAC. Those plants are going to GAC now. So he's a guy that's been ahead of the curve all along. I think the technology that we have with the data and the collection is like, state of the art, kind of moving outside the box, but being very innovative and creative with our water intake, water quality. And I think it just speaks to both of these gentlemen here tonight that their ingenuity and their expertise is coming into play. And it's really a good thing for the community.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
No further question, motion to suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call, Mr. Wexler. Second, Mrs. Crutch.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Motion to adopt?
Motion to adopt. Mrs. Crutch, second. Mr. Corbett?
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crouch?
Yes.
This ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing a contract for the water quality monitoring service near the water treatment plant intake.
Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. President. This piece of legislation actually is a piece of legislation that allows us to contract with a firm named Limnotech, who are experts in these data collection processes. And I think as we move forward, obviously, it's important to get the data, but it's also important to get it and do something with it. These people are experts. Adam, I know you've been in contact with them. You might want to comment on this. But obviously, these people have done this in other places, and they're, I think, an Ann Arbor firm. But Adam, if you want to make a comment, it'd be great.
Yeah, Lumitech's role in this is support for the most part, but they'll also work on managing our data and taking it to the cloud too. Gloss has a platform that will allow that data to be available in the cloud, so we have to reconfigure it basically to get into the Gloss system. Lumitech is currently doing a fairly similar system down in Delphus. We went down and looked at the system they have down there. And they put that system in, so they have some experience with it. Their application is a little different than ours, but it's similar enough. And they have a lot of experience in kind of logistics for this project.
Mr. Corbett.
Will this be a one-time cost or is this annual?
Well, I think there's going to be additional costs down the road with this. I mean, you have the equipment, you have the support at this point in time, but as we move forward, we've had discussions about looking at other places to put this technology as well. So we'll have to see exactly what it brings. It's hard for me to say for right now until we actually start collecting it and getting information on it.
How long will this one go for then? How long are they going to provide this service for $48,000?
This is through startup, and with the equipment that we did the previous, we're shooting at the first year's worth of reagents for the equipment. Startup through construction or through construction and through implementation. There probably will be some recurring costs with Lumitech, but it shouldn't be anything like this. It should just be support for us after that.
Mr. Waxler.
This also falls under that grant on this first round, correct?
Right.
So anything after this time will be on us, or is this something we can get continuous grant for that, or?
Well, I mean, I think we'll always be we always try to leverage grant money as much as we can, and I think that the Gloss is actually somebody that we've worked with, and I think that they should be interested in other places within these tributaries, right? Because when you look at Defiance and the location that we're in, it's pretty strategic to the Auglaize and the Maumee actually dumping into Lake Erie. So the hope is that we'll be able to get further grants along the way. Where it takes us and the information that we get from it remains to be seen. But I think that we've been working with the right people, especially with H2O Ohio and some other resources there as well, to try to leverage as much money as we can.
That's where I was going with that.
Yeah.
As much as we're running through here, our system, you would think there'd be money out there to help us continue.
And just like when Sean spoke of the wetlands and trying to filter out that water, those are the kind of things that we're seeing that it's available and tend to move forward with water quality. That's also a good piece to our CSO program, because while we might be having some problems with overflows, we're also doing some other things around the area and wetlands to filter some of that out. So we should be getting credit for some of that as well.
Is this something that the EPA and them look at that we're actually ahead of?
Pardon me?
Is this something that, we're always worried about the EPA and we're spending millions of dollars for the EPA? This is something that they should be saying, hey, look, this is something that could work in that area and help us downstream, right?
That's the hope.
Well, I know it's the hope. But
well, no, but that's the conversations that we've had with them as well.
Yeah.
That's the dialogue that we've had with EPA, that, you know what, on one end, yeah, we might be, having overflows, but at the other end, we want credit for doing these good things as well, to filter out the nutrients and putting water back into the river better than what we received.
The one thing I'd add to this too is, and again, geographically, this is the Maumee itself, west of town. So a lot of focus has been on the Oglays and on the Tiffin and all these other watersheds, and then on the river, one sits down toward Napoleon, Waterville and all that.
Yeah.
What this does specifically is blocks out all of that and goes just to the upper Maumee above our town. So the water conditions we see in the Maumee are not affected by us yet. So we can establish a baseline of what we are doing whenever they say, oh, your combined sewer flows cause this, or this does this, or this does this. It's like, okay, here's our baseline. This is what's really it looks like right now. Here's what we are doing. It's not as much as you think because it's coming in this way.
Correct.
So that geographically it matters a lot because we really do get to see the little dinky Maumee because it's really small above our plant with a lot of nutrients in it. And we've established that already, but this will allow us to really drive that home and put some serious numbers in.
The other nice thing, we're working with the city of Fort Wayne because they're doing some similar things and doing some water quality issues. So just like they're up river, right? They're taking on a responsibility, we're taking on a responsibility. The overall goal is to improve water quality downstream.
Okay. No further question, no suspending call.
You have no other questions? Motion to suspend and call, Mr. Waxler?
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast?
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mast?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Motion adopted.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Hancock?
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast?
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mast?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Right. And this ordinance is adopted. And lastly,
First reading by caption only, an ordinance amending codified ordinance 961.02 pertaining to the price of railroad easements and services in Riverside Cemetery, regulations pertaining to the collection thereof.
Mr. Leonard.
Yes, thank you. A few weeks ago, I brought some information on cemetery rates to council, and a few different alternatives to looking at possible rate increases. We haven't had a rate increase affect the cemetery since 2010. A lot of people in the room will remember we attempted to raise rates on the cemetery back in 2014, and that ordinance was overridden by the voters. Quite honestly, we probably tried to bite off more than we should have in that increase. They were significant at the time. In some cases, nearly doubling some of the rates that were in place. Lesson learned. Now we're 5-6 years later. We haven't touched the rates again since then. But the revenues that the cemetery brings in as a percentage of the cost to operate the cemetery keep getting smaller and smaller. So the revenues cover a much smaller portion of the total cost of the operation than they used to. So this ordinance takes a stab at rate increases that is much more modest than what we tried to do a few years ago. I think it'll be more palatable to the folks, and it's worth it'd be worth it if you'll indulge me for a minute to go through a little bit in detail of what the changes are. And of course, you've got copies in front of you. This is consistent with kind of the recommendation we were leaning towards a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago at this time. But the gist of it for the services, for most services in here, is a $25 increase on each service. So, for example, burial of ashes on a weekday, currently $200. This would raise it to $225. opening and closing of the mausoleum, which is currently $500, would be raised to $525. These rates vary a little bit by the time of the week, but again, $25 across the board per service as an increase. Disinterment fees, unchanged. There is just an addition in the language to specify that disinterments would only occur during the normal working hours through the week, Monday through Friday. But otherwise, those rates do not change. Interment costs, as already noted, $25 increases across the board. And again, just for reference, interment of an adult is currently $400 Monday through Friday. That would go to $425, and corresponding on Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. Again, $25 increases for each service over what is currently being charged. Couple other changes that have occurred in section C, about 2/3 down the page. Simply some language to clarify timeliness of payment. Basically indicating these charges be paid in full in advance of the time services are rendered. It does make the distinction that unless these services are under the direction and the expense of an attending funeral home. But again, that's some cleanup language that was included in the ordinance we did a few years ago. We still think it's necessary or advisable to make those changes. Maybe the most significant part of the ordinance is in the cost of the lots themselves. But again, well, not again, but what we've done is we've added a fixed rate for infant lots of $150 in the city, $200 to a non-resident of the city. Previously, a rate for an infant or a young child was at the discretion of the sexton and the city administrator. But I believe this rate has been more or less what's been in practice, so we're looking to codify that rate of $150. A single lot goes from $375 to a resident of the city to $400. Once again, a $25 increase. If there are 2 lots purchased, there is a discount for getting the second lot. That price goes, instead of $400 a piece, it would be $325 a piece for 2 lots. Previously, that was $600 for 2 lots. Now it would be $650. $25 on each lot is an increase. Sorry to repeat that so much, but I want to make the point. The significant difference here is that there would be no more quantity discount that would be applied to the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or any other lots purchased. That discount applies to the second lot and any additional ones that are purchased. So again, the first lot to a resident of the city would be $400. The second lot would be $325, and every lot thereafter would be $325. Currently, there is a significant discount as you buy 3 lots or 4 lots or 5 lots and more. And so maybe the most significant change again is the reduction or the elimination of some of those quantity discounts. In section E at the bottom of that first page, currently we have no provision. If someone purchased a lot 100 years ago and never used it, it's still on the books as a sold lot, and we really don't have much discretion in how we can repurpose or make that lot available again. So some language is included in the last ordinance. We've included it in this one as well that says that that lot should be subject to resale by the city if it's not used for the burial of human ashes or interment of human remains within 75 years following the date of purchase. So if a lot is purchased today and it's not used 75 years from now, the cemetery would have the ability to reclaim that lot, resell it to someone else. It does say in here that if, a family has bought 4 lots and one of those lots is used within the 75 years, the other 3 are secured. So just one has to be used within that 75-year period. That would solve kind of a dilemma that comes up occasionally. Section F is really just a cleanup. It refers to foundations. All headstones have to be erected on a foundation. And there's some antiquated language in here with fees that are charged for the foundations. We do not charge for the foundations. It's usually part of the service that is offered by a third party. So we've eliminated those fees that are in here because we don't actually charge them. And then there's the order of the way the ordinance or the code is written doesn't follow logical order. So we're authorizing Drain, who handles the codified ordinances, to reorder some of these as described in what looks like section 2 on page 2. Sorry to go into this in so much detail. I think it's important to note a couple of things. One, there is not an emergency clause on this ordinance. So if it was to be passed tonight, it would not take effect for 30 days. When we start talking about rate increases at the cemetery, history has shown that people will rightfully and intelligently take advantage of the window that would, the 30-day window that would present itself. If this were to pass tonight, we could actually see a little rush on the sale of lots in the next 30 days. Just something of note. Not a big deal, just something of note. But we couldn't really justify putting an emergency clause on it, and especially since it was such a contentious issue a few years ago. I do have 2 Scrivener's errors that I would like to point out. I was afraid when I walked in here this evening that I had done this. So we go from section 1, section 2, section 3, and then I repeat section 2 and section 3 at the bottom of the ordinance. Those should actually be section 4 and section 5. For Lisa's purposes, I can get a fresh copy printed, or maybe we can do that still before the evening is over, but that's up to you.
I can just mark it out, so.
Okay. Yep, that's on me. I did this ordinance and added 2 sections and didn't renumber them. That's all I've got.
That's it?
Yep.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard? All right, Mr. Waxler?
I'd like to make a motion that we let this get 3 readings.
Yeah, you would do that by just making a motion to let consideration of the matter lie.
Yeah, just let lie then.
Motion to let lie?
I'll second.
Second, Mr. Corbett?
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Wexler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
We will let this issue lie.
You just want to print a new one then, John?
I'm sorry?
You just want to print a new one for me then?
I will. Yep.
Okay.
All right. With the items of legislation addressed for this evening, we have some time for citizens' concerns. Mr. Lundberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. My pastor has asked me to come here tonight to help inform the city that the St. Paul's United Methodist Church on Wednesday evenings.
I hate to be pedantic, because everyone knows you. You're a local celebrity. But would you state your name and your address?
I'm very sorry. I've never done this before. No, my name is Peter Lundberg and I live at 785 Miami Drive. Thank you, Mr. President, for reminding me. But the St. Paul's United Methodist Church, beginning 2 weeks ago, is doing a community meal on Wednesday evening from 5 to 7 p.m. And for that purpose, it is a free will offering meal, but it is open to everyone in the city. And if you can't afford a free will, you're welcome to come and have a meal. And that's the most important part of this and the mission of St. Paul's. It's part of our food pantry program. and it's an expansion of our Wednesday night evening program. Over the last 2 weeks, we've had just a couple users of that because it's so hard to get the word out. So he asked me to come tonight to help get the word out to the community that this is something that is available and will continue most evenings other than during the holidays and little things like that. But once we get rolling, we'll be able to produce information better. This particular week, it's lasagna, both a roasted vegetable for an entree and a traditional lasagna along with hamburgers, cheeseburgers, french fries, grilled cheese with ham, a soup, a salad, and all the other accompaniments that come with a meal. So thank you very much for your allowing me to be here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. And does any member of council have an email or anything that citizen wish to share during citizens' concerns? If not, we'll stretch our legs for a few minutes. We have a couple executive sessions